it's this again. Why is it this again? Why is this happening again? I don't know, but once again, it is the Santa Cruz region's hottest Google Slides live stream. Part one in a series on low-grade miracles. Now, the miracle I'm talking about today is thematically connected to Artemidorus, to the dream interpretation stuff, kind of, although it's going to impart a very different perspective on that same material. Now, here is a miracle power that I wish that I had. There's a guy named Abba Maches who can fall asleep on just a goddamn dime. He doesn't even need any drugs to fall asleep. Doesn't need ketamine, doesn't need Ambien. He just drops right the fuck off, and all he needs to do that is for you to start talking to him about worldly stuff. Now, the guy can stay awake for any number of psalms or selections from the Gospels or what have you. He can do psalms for just fucking days. But the minute you start gossiping about Kesha, he's out like a light. He's just gone. Now, Abba Maches prayed to God for this power. John Cassian tells us. John Cassian says Abba Maches prayed to God for the power to fall asleep whenever anyone talked about anything interesting. And John Cassian also considers this power quite remarkable. Now, John Cassian, who is that? To introduce one of our major players here, John Cassian is kind of a groupie, a deadhead of the monk world. He's born in Scythia around 360 AD, and Scythia in the Roman Empire is not really what you think of when you hear the word Scythia. It's like Bulgaria. It's like the armpit of Eastern Europe. So he's born there, but then he goes on the road and he hits all the big monk shows. He goes to Palestine. He's in a monastery in Bethlehem for a while in the Near East. He goes to Egypt. He hangs out with the Desert Fathers in a couple of their little monasteries there. The Desert Fathers are some powerful low-grade miracle workers. We're going to hear about them as the series goes on too. John Cassian hits up a few other places. He goes to Rome, and finally, putting all that legwork in, he is allowed to start his own monastery in the province of Gaul in France. Now this 360 CE, it's late antiquity. A lot of stuff going on in the Roman world. It's sort of the last flowering of Roman power before the whole thing falls apart for good. But it's also the period of time at which being a monk, quote unquote, is kind of being invented. People are figuring out what being a monk means. Because being a monk and being in a monastery means treating Christianity as a kind of an institution, right? You got this monastery, it's a building, it's some properties, it's all that stuff. It's very publicly Christian. And that can only happen once Christianity is legalized. As we're talking about second, very early 4th century, that whole period is a period in which Christianity is not explicitly legalized and occasionally, though not all the time, is subject to official persecution, to property confiscation. So as long as that's going on, much as it wasn't really possible to have weed stores before there was legalization in California, you couldn't really have monasteries. But once Christianity is officially kind of legalized by Constantine in 313 and then becomes increasingly kind of part of the state over the 4th century, it becomes much easier to have these monasteries. So being a monk is just getting kind of invented right now, and it gets started in these parts of the Eastern Roman Empire, in Palestine, in Egypt, where John Cassian is spending the early years of his life. Sort of open-mouthedly admiring these great founders of monasteries, these monks, these anchorites, the people who retreat from the world. And then he shows up in the Western Roman world, and he's like, I know how to do this. I know how to be a monk. I bring the coolest monk behaviors from the East. So this is like an extremely creditable thing for him to be doing. People are all extremely psyched to have an experienced monk leader set up their monasteries for him. And he writes this book called Instituti Coenobiorum, the Institutes of the Monks. And that book becomes hugely influential via Benedict, whose Rule of Benedict you might have heard of, but that rule is kind of the founding code for all the monasteries in Europe. So John Cassian's bringing that knowledge over from the Eastern Roman Empire and transmits it to the Western Roman Empire. So he's a man of his times in that respect. He is into the same kind of monking that everybody thinks is cool at this moment. In other ways, he's kind of idiosyncratic, as we'll see. And he often defends his kind of idiosyncratic position using arguments, but also using these miracle stories. Remember, miracle stories work as a kind of rhetorical strategy for debates within Christianity. And one of those miracles that makes an argument is what we're going to be talking about today, the miracle of Abba Maces and his magic Sleepytime power, which really falls at the intersection of two streets. It's a miracle that says something about problems of speech, and a miracle that says something about problems of sleep. And in both respects, John Cassian is expressing a somewhat idiosyncratic view, which runs throughout all of his work, which is that Satan is always coming at you. Mr. Satan's main goal is to beat monks. So monks are the athletes of gods. He's constantly comparing them to Olympic athletes or to soldiers. So Satan really wants to beat monks. You can see how this would produce a certain amount of self-satisfaction. For monks, it's a bit of a narcissistic view, but it's John Cassian's view. Satan's always trying to demolish the sanctity of monks by temptation. And this is not a temptation that you can beat by your own effort. Your own efforts will always lose. You can't beat Satan without God's help, John Cassian says. Of course, having a good code of rules to follow doesn't hurt either. In particular, obedience is super important for him and is going to be important in Western monasteries as well. But you cannot beat Satan's attempts to subvert your monkishness without the help of God. And one way that Satan gets in at you, is by worldly conversation, which means kind of gossip roughly, but also talking about any topic that is not strictly speaking God or Bible related. Because monks renounce the world when they enter a monastery. Talking about it incites memories of it, incites desires for it. You know, you think you're out, but when you hear this worldly conversation, it pulls you back in for one last big score, and that's how Satan gets at you. It is a temptation to which you're exposed, and you cannot resist unless you pray to God for a special power that allows you to avoid worldly conversation. Satan can't get at you if you're asleep all the time when people are gossiping. So that's what Abba Maces prays for. He prays for freedom from gossip, freedom from world conversation, and God listens and grants him this miraculous power, since Abba Maces is a holy monk. By the way, in this period in the 4th century, it's still a little bit debatable whether being a monk, whether living in a monastery or living withdrawn from civilization actually makes you holy, whether that's a good thing to do even. So John Cassian's making, among other points, the point that being a monk gets you holy points, increases your holiness score with God. And the miracle is proof of that, he says. But then why solve this problem with sleep? Why not just make Abba Maces like selectively deaf? Why not make Abba Maces head turn into a pumpkin whenever people start talking about worldly stuff? There are a lot of solutions to this problem, but Sleep is an interesting one for John Cassian because he also treats it as very problematic. It's another way that Satan gets you. Satan attacks, as we've seen with this kind of like conversations other people are having near you, things people say to you. Satan attacks through things you can't control. And on John Cassian's view, sleep is one of those things. You can't control what you see when you sleep. Dreams. Dreams are the things that John Cassian is maybe most consistently paranoid about in all of his writings about the monkish life. He's paranoid especially about sexy dreams, which you get if you're chaste, as in not having sex, but not chaste of heart. He says that you are guilty for having sexy dreams. And for that reason, he also says it's better for monks, if they're having a big long day of prayer that's getting them lots of holiness points, to stay up all night. Because if they fall asleep and they have a sexy dream, then all of those holy points are going to be lost. It's like when Sonic gets hit by an enemy, the rings go everywhere. Doesn't matter how many holy points you have one single sexy dream, and your prayers are ruined. There are other categories of dreams that are problems as well, like maybe you dream of your relatives, you dream of your old property. Any of these things that attach you to the world, Satan can put them into your dreams, and that's how he beats monks. Gets a lot of monks. Well, one of the things that Abba Maques' miracle shows is that sleep is not always bad. It matters to a certain extent when and where you do it. It has this kind of instrumental value. Oh, sleep isn't always bad. You can use sleep to avoid hearing gossip, avoid hearing worldly conversations. Sleep, like everything in nature on John Cassian's view, is basically good. It's something that we just fuck up because of our sin. And holiness can fix it. And this is really good advertisement for John Cassian's particular brand of sanctity. It's a good advertisement for being a monk. All of these basic human behaviors, like having conversation, being awake, being asleep, are ways for Satan to subvert you, Satan to get at you. But if you're a monk, and if you do a really good job of it, you can actually beat Satan. You can get around him. You can zag on him. You can get around Satan. So this is, a miracle solution you can try at home if you are having, problems with Satan or whatever during your enforced being at home. And if the Artemidorus series gave you too many bad or weird dreams, try praying. Maybe you'll fall asleep whenever anything interesting comes on Netflix or what have you. But you will be able to stay awake for all of those tedious prayers. With that advice, I leave you for this week, but I do hope to see you back here next time.